So before we start, while we get the tech set up, just one quick note before we get the show rolling. This is going to be a talk in 3 acts. By the middle of Act 2, you are going to be confused. And that's okay. Don't blame yourself. By the end of Act 3, I hope that we've resolved all the internal conflict that you'll be feeling at that time. Cool. So first thing we need is, I think, we need some music. Cool. So, this is a talk about you. Yes, I mean you, the human person currently in this room. At first, you were surprised that the man on the stage was speaking about you, but then you thought about it and this made you quite happy. You are the most important thing to you. This is a talk about you. You were born many years ago, but not that many really when you think about it. Sometimes it feels like the days blend into each other. You cannot believe how quickly the years go by. You used to have hobbies and various interests. You still do, of course, but you don't spend as much time on them as you used to. You'd like to, though, and sometimes you wonder, how is it that you'd like to do something, but you just don't? You have a different mission now. You are a software developer, and this is a talk about you. Every morning you open your laptop and you see the code you wrote yesterday. Today you are going to write some more code. You pick up a ticket from the issue board. There are lanes on the board. Your job is to move the tickets from left to right. Sometimes you think there are too many lanes, and sometimes you think there are too few. Sometimes you're frustrated about having to move these tickets from left to right, but mostly when you move that ticket, it brings you a sense of deep satisfaction. The closer the ticket moves to the right side of your screen, the happier you feel. You go to meetings, but not too many. It's good not to have to go to too many meetings, you think? It's hard for you to get into flow sometimes. You sigh and boot up your simulator. You are a React Native developer. You didn't always used to be. Before this, you worked on some other library that was not really that different, but different enough for you to be still interested in what you're doing now. It's the best job you ever had. When you started your last job, everything was very interesting at first too, but after a while, it started to feel a bit same. When you think back, you can't quite distinguish one day from another. If you think about it, you realize that what you're working on now will eventually become less interesting to you too. This is just how you are, but mostly you don't think about it. When you are in that excited phase of what you're working on, you go so deep you forget what it feels like to be bored. Eventually, you'll grow tired of this job too, but it doesn't bother you too much. You know you can always get another job. You are on the up and up. Your skills are in demand. Life is pretty good. Things work surprisingly well considering what a massive hack this whole React Native thing is, if you really think about it. But you don't like to think about it. It makes you uncomfortable to think about it. You are used to everything being broken at all times. When you Google for error messages, you see familiar purple links to GitHub issues. You click through to them and discover they still haven't been fixed. You briefly consider updating your fork of the repo and fixing it yourself, but then you look at the column of cards stacking on the left side of your monitor and you decide, not today. You scroll back up and add an emoji reaction to the original post, only to discover you already did that last week and nothing changed. Someone should really fix this, you think. There's just so much to know. You wonder, how can anyone be smart enough to know everything it takes to fix this one issue? Java, Objective-C, JavaScript, C++, your head swims for a moment. You shake it off and refocus on the task at hand. You really need to get this done today to stay on track for the rest of the sprint. You feel a slight tremor of dread. You're not a bad developer as far as it goes, you're up to date. You picture your knowledge as an incomplete map, full of exciting new places to discover. Tile by tile, the map of what you know gets colored in. The streets connect to avenues and form large conduits of knowledge that you are proud of. Expanding the map of the world that is familiar to you is the most satisfying part of your job. Still, you try not to compare yourself to Dan Abramov. You know nothing good can come out of it. Instead, you like to compare yourself to those former colleagues of yours who are still working on that legacy technology. You feel a little sorry for them. When you meet them for drinks, you talk about the old times, but eventually you find a way to move the conversation to what you're working on now. Even though you could tell them about the 1,000 small things that aren't quite right, the tiny annoyances, that Android performance bug that you're fighting with, you don't. You put a positive spin on it and tell them how great React Native is, because you are a React Native developer. But you've begun to notice that saying this doesn't actually quite get as many curious questions and hushed, respectful nods as it used to. More and more your peers have tried it for themselves, and the CVs that your boss slings on your desk for review claim to have experience in React Native. It's no longer cutting edge to be a React Native developer, but they don't have real experience, not like you. They haven't slogged through the deep mud like you have, so you're not threatened by them. Sometimes you go to conferences like this one, and you meet other weary travelers and you swap stories from the road. You enjoy that. It gives you a sense of belonging. And every talk you hear sketches new remote parts of the map of what you know, more exciting outlines for you to explore. Every talk except this one. This talk is about you. Now, we're gonna kick this up a bit. Today, you are sitting at your desk. You've got a cup of coffee on the go. The coffee is not hot anymore, and you glance at it trying to decide whether it's still hot enough to sip. You think about getting a new cup, but you decide to hold out a little bit longer until you get to a good point to commit. You are working on a ticket. You've been working on it since yesterday. You don't know why it's important that you're working on this particular ticket, but that is okay. The client decided it's the next most important thing for you to do. You hope you can finish it today, but you feel distracted. It's because you heard the client is coming to visit. You've never met the client. You're nervous about meeting him. His emails are always short and never quite right. They say things like, the users are complaining the app is slow. You don't know what to do about it. Fuck, says Jay. Jay sits at the desk next to yours. You look at her and you see the red screen of death glaring on her monitor. You chuckle and consider giving her a hand, but you decide not to. We all have our own crosses to bear. You sigh and dive back into the code. You realize you might need to break down this massive reducer, but you're trying not to do it because it's tedious work. You think maybe it's finally time to switch to Apollo. Suddenly, you feel a presence behind you. You focus your eyes to the reflection in your monitor, but you don't see anything except your own tired-looking face. You turn around, surprised to find a very short man standing in front of you. You are sitting down, he is standing up, but your eyes are at level. His eyes are completely pitch black and an oddly perfect distance from each other. You can tell the fabric of his suit is expensive, but his trousers and jacket sleeves are too long for his short frame. His shortness is somehow threatening to you, as if there was supposed to be more to him that was invisible. Are you the client? You ask. The short man doesn't say anything. You recognize the silence. It's the same silence you get when you reply to the client's emails asking for more information about what exactly do the users find slow about the app. You swing your chair around to check in with Jay. You're seeing this guy too, right? But Jay is not at her desk. You are sure she was there just minutes ago. You must have been in the zone. Suddenly a question enters your mind that you've never thought to ask before. What happened to the previous developers you inherited this app from? The developers whose terrible legacy code you painstakingly refactored and rewrote. The question feels loaded with meaning, but you're not sure why it occurred to you right now. The client tilts his head towards the door and walks out. You hesitate for a moment but decide to follow him down the empty corridor out across the street to the parking lot. There's an acid smell in the air. Luminescent puddles dot the potholed car lot. It must have rained. The client opens the rear door of a black van. The van is covered in dust despite the rain. You get into the van. You're not asking questions. The client has come to visit. This never happens. The client takes the driver's seat. He pulls out from the parking lot with an awkward 4-point turn and out onto the road. There is no traffic. There's never any traffic anymore except a few self-driving Uber cars, but even those are somewhere else today. When you look at the client through the rearview mirror, you only see his black eyes fixed on the road. By the highway next to the abandoned supermarket, you see the same homeless man who always camps there. You're glad the van's windows are tinted. You don't like when the homeless man notices you. He always seems to pay extra attention to you and you don't know why. You heard a rumor he used to be a software developer too, in the days before the cleanse. Your life is good and you don't like to be reminded how fleeting it all could be. The client drives you through the edges of the city and the buildings start to thin out, replaced with clusters of ramshackle shanties and the only vast nothingness. You have entered the wastelands. You remember there used to be small bushes here. Your parents used to talk about walking in the forest before it was cut down and cleared to erase the toxic radiation. But now, there's just bleached sand and the occasional billboard advertising things people in this town haven't been able to afford for a long time. Not since the Bitcoin crash. It's okay. You are doing well. You are needed. Your skills are in demand. Then in the distance you see an improbably large warehouse growing ever larger as you approach. You've never seen it before. You've never been this far out to the wasteland before. Why would you? You know there used to be a tire factory around here when new things were still being made. Inside, the warehouse is pitch dark. Your eyes start to adjust to the low light and you see rows and rows of small desks like those back at school. Hundreds of them, thousands probably, and at each desk you see a figure illuminated only by the phone in their hand, flickering in hues of white and blue as their bony fingers scroll, tap, tap the screens. What now, you ask, not expecting an answer. Wait, the client says, and you twitch at the sound of his voice. It is shrill and too loud to have come from his small body, echoing and bouncing on the bare iron walls of the warehouse. Who are all these people, you think, but don't say. You hear a ringing of a servant's bell coming from somewhere in the vast dark space. You squint and see an arm swing up a dozen rows back. The client claps his hands. The figure gets up from his desk and walks towards you with a steady, even gait. You decide he's a man, but you could be wrong. The figure is thin and his shoulders are rounded, giving him an otter-like silhouette. His face is shrouded in darkness and you can't determine his facial features or whether he has any features at all. But it doesn't matter. You immediately recognize him from his backlit silhouette. He is the man from the standard profile image placeholder you use for the new users of your application. The same sloped shoulders, the same oblong head, the one that was always there, the one that client never allowed you to change, the one that nobody ever seems to replace, although you spent a lot of time making sure the profile picture upload worked reliably. You realize that he is the user of your app. You look around the warehouse and you realize these are the users of your app. The user hands you his phone. You see it's the main screen, but instead, where the content should be, there is a crudely drawn face made of 2 dots and a downwards curving line. And the text, "Oops, something went wrong." You pull to refresh, but nothing happens. You mash the screen, nothing continues to happen. You curse yourself as you think of the ticket in the leftmost lane of the board that says, "Better error messages." It's been there forever. You never thought you'd yearn to see the familiar red screen of death, but right now you long for the burning glow that would help illuminate the situation. You need to say something, but you can't. The API must be down, you think, but you don't say. You sense passing the blame is not going to help here. And passing the blame to whom? You realize you've never met the API developers either. You shrug. The faceless user shrugs his rounded shoulders. The client does not shrug. The user takes the phone from you, and as he brushes your hand with his, you feel his fingertips are completely smooth and ice cold. "Fix it!" The client snarls and takes a step back into the darkness, leaving you blinking in the faint light of 1,000 phone screens stretching to the back of the warehouse that is too far for you to see. Back outside, the car park is completely empty. You don't remember seeing any bus stops along the road you drive in. You wonder, how do the users get here? And where do they go? You shoot off a message to your team Slack. You think twice before tagging @here. You've been chided for overusing it before, but you figure this is probably an appropriate time. You drop a pin in the middle of nothingness that on the map could be a sand-colored ocean. "Please, pick me up from the old tire factory at the edge of the wasteland. I've met the clients. Please, I've met the users." You sit down, and in the narrow slice of shade cast by the corrugated iron roof of the factory to take shelter from the smog-filtered sunlight, you could go back in and ask one of the users for help, but you don't. You are frightened of the users. As you sit and stare at your phone screen waiting for somebody to begin typing, all the questions you never really asked rush at you all at once. Who are the users? You have been eyeing the metrics since starting this job, and you were happy when the amount of active sessions were growing. You look at the old tire factory mentally estimate its size, and you realize that for your analytics to be accurate, there must be hundreds of other warehouses just like this spread across the wasteland. What is the purpose of the app? For over a year now, you have diligently written code, written tests, migrated from one library to another, but you never thought to ask yourself, what is the purpose of all this? All those features and requirements you studied and fulfilled, each more or less clearly defined, each made sense, but you had never thought about the complete picture the pieces form when you put them together. Why, you ask yourself as the afternoon begins to grow red and the shadow of the factory grows longer. You won't be able to survive the night in the wasteland, and you can't go back into the warehouse. You shudder when you remember the cold, smooth touch of the user's fingertips. Then you see a pillow of dust rise from a point in the distance. It's a car, and you hope it's the client coming back to get you, and you hope it's not. Hesitantly, you walk up to the road and lift up your thumb. The car slows down, an old rickety pickup, and a woman rolls down the hand crank window, her shoulder pumping up and down. And you're glad to see her shoulders are not sloped, and she has an identifiable face framed by black glossy hair. Her light brown complexion shows no signs of radiation poisoning. "Hey newbie," she smiles. You don't move. She rolls her eyes, frustrated. "I am Emery," she says, as if that would explain everything. And incredibly, it does. You know that name so well. You've never met Emery, but you know her intimately. For years now, you have studied her git commit messages, trying to understand the inner workings of her mind. You are the original developer of the app, you say, stunned at yet another twist at this weird-ass day. She laughs, maybe at you, maybe with you. "No," she says, "I'm not the original. I just rewrote it just like you have done." And all at once, it dawns on you the generations and generations, people building and rebuilding this app. A picture of a man flashes in front of your eyes, bearded, hollow-eyed, crazy-looking, filing punch cards into the blinking console of a mainframe computer. It's the homeless man at the roundabout at the abandoned supermarkets, the original developer. And you see the next girl or guy who will come after you and who will only know you from your cryptic commit messages, who will git blame you for everything and who will rewrite the code you wrote until there is nothing left of your work. In Flutter, maybe. You don't know or care anymore. I have some questions, you say to Emery, who is impatiently tapping the steering wheel of the old pickup, waiting for you to reach your conclusion. Good, she says. Now get in before it gets dark. You climb in, and she drives silently towards yet another sunset in the wasteland. So, yeah. Yep. Cool. So, so I think at this point I owe some of you an explanation. So let's start from the beginning. This has been a talk about you, but it's also a talk about, a person next to you, and it's about the hundreds of React Native developers that I've met over the last few years, just going to conferences on Twitter, on GitHub. And of course, it's a talk about me as well. My name is Jani, and I'm a React Native developer. I work at Formidable in London. And I didn't always used to be a React Native developer, just like you. Before I worked with other libraries that were not that different, but they were still different enough that I'm still into what I'm doing right now. But I've also started to slowly come up, from the weird fugue state that we as developers sometimes get into, where the technology itself is so exciting that it kind of it becomes the only thing that you think about. And now that React Native itself is increasingly mainstream and there's new contenders like Flutter coming up, I can't help but zoom out and ask, why are we doing this, and do I want to go through all this again? How is the world anyway a different or better place because of the work that you do, or before the work that I do? So when I was invited to speak here, instead of talking about technology itself, I wanted to examine some of the kind of core tenets and principles of our community from a different point of view, and I chose this weird format because I figured that would catch your attention. But I started to ask myself some hard questions, and then I went on to speak to many of you. You know who you are. We've had these conversations. And the picture that emerges to me from those discussions is one of thousands of incredibly bright people who are working very, very, very hard on all the same problems. But the problem is that those problems that they're working on are just inherently, they're inward gazing and they're technological, they're problems about technology. And this is not a nihilistic point. Despite this whole wasteland metaphor thing, I believe that the work that we do can actually have an impact and it can have meaning, but only if we choose to give it meaning, only if we choose to work on things that have meaning. And so in my job, I interview a lot of candidates, and the thing that keeps coming up is people prioritize maximizing learning as the way of choosing their job, as the primary motivation. Working with fresh technologies, just making sure that you're keeping up to date. And I think this is fine. I think self-improvement is a fantastic quality in an engineer, especially earlier in your career. It's very important that you work in environments where you can maximize your learning. But, in order to be able to actually do something, you need to be good at what you do. So this is all fine and dandy. But still, I want to ask the question, what is the impact of work that we actually do? And And I want you to ask yourself that question, which this is why this talk is about you. And surely all those skills that you learn here today aren't for their own sake. Like, shouldn't there be some kind of goal or end game, to some purpose that you can use to, like these tools and techniques and all these skills that you have working towards? So in fact, for me, the wasteland, it's a metaphor for the technology obsession that we all share, myself very much included. We're so focused on the how of things that we sometimes forget to ask the what, and almost always forget to ask why. So when it comes to building software products, I think the how is the technology, the programming languages, the libraries, the processes that we use to organize our work. It's the tactics of everyday work. Now, the what is the product that you're building. It's entirely decoupled from technology. It's the thing that it's supposed to do, whether it's apps or services or open source libraries or anything else. And I feel like what is kind of like the strategy, the high level sort of thing that we are using. But there's no good having the best tactics and having the smartest strategy if you're not fighting for a good cause. So I think why should be the goal of our work. Why is it important for you, the human person, the meat bag in this room right now, working on this particular app or service or library that you're currently working on? Who does it benefit? And how effective is it as a tool to reaching that goal? I think we as developers, we're some of the most privileged people in the world. But we're making decisions like we're facing scarcity. Like, we're always thinking about the problems we have today and rarely about those problems of tomorrow, and even less we're talking about like other people's problems. And what you may not realize that you, the human person in this room, are one of the most powerful people currently alive. Maybe not like the 1%, because that's the bankers, but programmers come like closely after, so we're like top 5% at least. And that's because the world is growing increasingly digital, our culture is digital, many of our problems are caused by technology, and ironically, we can actually solve many of those problems with technology, though not all of them. So technology, especially software, is just a tool, it's just an instrument, and you as a programmer have the tools to build meaningful things and solve problems in the real world. And you are not a bad developer as far as it goes, you are up to date. I mean, like, I guess like if you want to really torture the metaphor, like, like you shouldn't be driven around by the client. Like, I think you are in the driving seat of when it comes to, choosing where to direct your, powers towards. And despite this wasteland metaphor, I'm not talking about like solving global warming or acid rain or deforestation. Although if you can make an app that can solve that in React Native, then that, just go ahead and do that. But what I'm talking about is more like being aware of your position and privilege and power in the world and making sure that you are actually using, making good use of them. Because for every conversation that we have about Redux versus MobX or REST versus GraphQL, I think we should have at least like one conversation about like who is the user of the application, how can we better serve their needs, and what are their goals, and are those goals aligned with yours? So when we apply for new jobs, I think we should ask whether, we should ask whether they're using the modern technology stack, but also like what is the local and global impact of the work that they do? And again, I'm not suggesting that we should set the bar impossibly high and only work for charities and NGOs and idealist disruptors like trying to fix the world. There is an ethical element, of course, in play. Like, I personally would never build software for weapons manufacturers or oil companies or gambling companies or tyrannical governments. And you probably have a code like that too, and your list will look different. Maybe it includes, banking or porn or whatever you think is objectionable. But beyond that, I think there's also value. There's also great, meaningful value. And this is something that Gant talked about, building things that aren't obviously impactful, things that bring people happiness and joy and enable people to be more connected and creative, or simply getting a better experience when they go through their daily lives, whether it's a software library that you write for other developers, or a piece of software people need to use to fulfill their jobs, or do their taxes, or improve their health, or learn new skills, or organize their notes, or do their banking, to make sure that they have the best insurance plan, or buy things they need and definitely not buy things that they don't need. So I want to be extraordinarily clear about this one final point. What I'm saying here should not in any way be taken to detract from the brilliant content that we've had at this conference, and you know, all the great content that we have ahead for the rest of the day. Although I do feel a bit sorry about the guy who has to follow Gant and me, but you know. It's not about the why instead of the how. It's about remembering the why while we're so deep amidst the how. Like when we're so deep in that fugue state where we're just like, you know, like focusing on that one thing, we really, really need to take a stop sometimes and ask ourselves some hard questions. Technology is just a tool, and it's a very important one. So when you're enjoying the rest of this conference, and when you go back home, and you put into use the things that you've learned here over these 2 or 4 days, depending if you did the workshops, I hope you remember that this talk was not about a mysterious developer driving into the wasteland sunsets. This talk was about you.